Hey, everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the poverty cycle. It's sometimes referred to as the poverty trap, and just trying to understand what it is. In terms of economic development, it might be easier to think about this as a development trap, meaning that you're thinking about the whole country as it and looking at how it's the inability to get out of the state of undevelopment, right, or not being developed. But I think it's actually easier in many ways to make these things talk about people. And so if you think about poverty cycle, a poverty cycle applies to people who are low income earners. And as a result of that low income, earning a low amount of income, they get trapped in this cycle of poverty. And of course, if you have a country and enough people are trapped in this low level of poverty, then the country itself is going to be caught in a poverty trap or poverty cycle, and therefore you have a development trap. Okay, so let's take a look at the next slide. And before we get here, or look into the actual cycle itself, I wanted to put this up there for you. But there are two terms you really need to know, and I'm kind of assuming that you understand them in this video. And one is relative poverty, and the other is absolute poverty. And of course, I absolutely think it's ridiculous that we're throwing these relative terms on poverty, like you're poor but not poor enough, which is a nice way of saying relative poverty. Absolute poverty is like saying, no, you're like super poor. And that makes me really uncomfortable as an instructor, really careful with my words. But relative poverty, if you get past that, it really is just how relatively poor is a certain segment of your population according to the overall maybe living standard of a country. And this standard is set by the government, right? So if the average income is whatever amount of money, a company or a government might decide that relative poverty is like 40% of that income. So it's set by domestic governments. Absolute poverty is the level of absolute poverty measured in terms of basic necessities for survival. It's the amount of money that a person needs to have in order to live. And those types of things would be like, can they buy food? Can they buy clothing? Can they afford shelter? And these types of things are generally governed by world organizations, like, say, the World Bank, which uses $1.25 a day as the absolute poverty line. Or they'd even have a farther classification of that, and they would say these people are in extreme poverty. In any event, poverty generates more poverty. And all of us don't want to believe that. But if you think about a low-income family, it's more often that it takes several generations of people living at a low-income level to break out of that cycle. And the way in which you can explain that is to look at this diagram right here. Okay, it kind of starts in the middle, not even kind of. It does start in the middle, okay? So take a look right here at low incomes, right? This is the key to understanding this entire diagram. And this is a really useful thing to use, and not only to organize your ideas, but also maybe in some sort of analysis, okay? So if a family starts off with a low income, relatively speaking, right, versus people with high incomes, they're going to be deemed sort of less productive or have low productivity. If there are enough people in a country that have low incomes, then you're going to have low productivity of your workers, which leads to low levels of human capital. Human capital, of course, is the ability of the people in your society to produce goods, right? Human capital, they're not as valuable. It's kind of a terrible way of thinking about humans. But you get it. Like, this is the capacity maybe of the people who live in a particular country. If they have low levels of human capital, that means they have low levels of education, generally, and low levels of healthcare. And if you have low levels of healthcare, then you're going to tend, and education, that's going to tend to create income earners that fall into the low income category. If you're a low income so that's the idea of development, right? Low income leads to low productivity, leads to low human capital, leads to low levels of education and healthcare, which the next generation will most likely have low incomes. Trap. If you look at the other way, which is looking towards growth, low incomes, if you don't have that much money, you are not going to be able to save that much money. And in a country where there are, generally speaking, people with low incomes, then there's not going to be that much money relative to other countries in financial institutions that will enable them to wrap up those savings. Because if you remember back, savings are a form of, the banks take people's savings and they turn them into something called loans, of course, and that's used for investment. Investment leads to high economic growth. But if you live in a country with low incomes, that means that there will be very little money deposited by society in financial institutions, which means that financial institutions don't have that much money in order to create loans that would stimulate investment and growth. And if you don't have investment, you're going to have low economic growth, which means you're not going to have the kinds of jobs that are available or would be available in order to have high incomes. So you're back to low incomes. So in going in sort of both directions here, right? Whether you're thinking about economic growth or you're thinking about economic development, if you are in a country that has low incomes, this development is going to feed into low levels of income, and this growth is going to feed into low levels of income, and all of a sudden you have a cycle here that just perpetuates itself over and over and over again, and that really inhibits growth, and growth is going to inhibit development. Okay, so this is a really useful idea in your mind, and I like this idea of growth and development of a country, and then the analogy of growth and development of a human being. Obviously, in a general way, assuming that the development of a human being is going to happen after growth, right? So someone grows tall, and then their body fills out, and they develop, right? Okay, well, countries are going to first need growth first in order to have certain levels of income, right? In order to have investment to create more growth. Then that would lead to higher incomes, which would lead to more productivity, higher levels of human capital, and higher levels of education. So, but if you're stuck in this place where everybody has low incomes, you can't grow, then you can't develop, and now you're just circling around and around and around. Okay, pretty key understanding for understanding development, and not exactly the most uplifting thing. But what this is going to do is show you how later on, how maybe foreign direct investment can kick certain people out of this low level of income area and actually stimulate growth. All right, so I ended on a positive. There you go. All right, I hope you found this video to be helpful. We'll talk to you in a bit.